course, you've done Introduction to Social Psychology, or at least Introduction to Psychology, or if you've heard something about social psychology. And we have a bunch of very classic social psychology studies that came after mostly the Second World War, trying to understand human nature. So I want to ask you, what classic studies do you know about social psychology regarding human nature? What comes to mind when I talk about social psychology and human nature? What do you know? What kind of studies? The Stanford Prison Experiment. Great. Can you tell us a little bit about what you remember from the Stanford Prison Experiment? Yes, very good. Yeah. So I think the main message with this experiment, so I'll just repeat what she said. So there's a simulation of a prison where allegedly students come in and they're randomly assigned to be either prisoners or jailers, the ones taking care of the jail. And then after a while, the jailers become a little bit too aggressive. And this generally is taken to understand that power corrupts. So if you put people in a position of power, then after some time, they'll abuse that power and they'll become overly aggressive. And the way that the story goes in most of the books is that this has, they had to stop the experiment because the jailers became too aggressive. So there was real abuse there. And we have videos and we have recordings about all sorts of things that happen there. Thank you very much. Good example, Stanford Prison Experiment. What else? Any others? What else do we know about human nature? Please, yes. The what, sorry? Can you tell us? Yes. Conflict.
Interactors.
Okay.
So it kind of hypothesizes that you need to have common goals and stuff like that to counter.
Perfect. Can you tell us a little bit about the findings, what the findings were? Okay. Yeah. So in-group, out-group experiments, stuff that contrast the in-group versus the out-group, are very prominent, go back, way back to the beginning of social psychology. And we'll be talking a little bit about the contrasting between in-group and out-group. Very good, very prominent topic in social psychology. Very good. Anything else? I saw somebody else raising hands, no? Anything else? Sorry? Bandura. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit? Social learning theory and children. Yeah. Yeah, imitating behavior. Do you remember a little bit about what happened over there?
Probably was like watching TV or something.
Mm-hmm.
Felt like punching the doll.
Punching the doll, right. Right. Yeah. So some very good studies about kids' developmental stuff, and then what happens to humans when you put them in a certain situation, you do some intervention to them, and then you give them the ability to become violent, or even if it's just like a doll. So how much of their violence will come into play? Very good. Bandura is a big name in social psychology and developmental. You said you wanted something? Somebody raised hand? You? Okay. Stanley Milgram experiment. Yes. Conformity.
And they know there is a foreseeable like negative outcome. Like they will like they assign people to be the teacher and receive the instruction to press the button to deliver the electric shock student.
Yeah.
Students been actually the findings like the majority of it's going to choose to compare to obey.
Yes, very good. Classic experiment, very troubling about if you're being assigned to be a teacher and the ability to give electric shocks to a student. This is deception. There are no real students over there, but it seems as if you're really hurting the other person to the point of them losing consciousness or ceasing to respond. And there's an experimenter in a white coat saying the procedure, you must proceed, the experiment must proceed, you must continue. People seem to keep going with the shocks, even though it's really seems to be very painful for the other side. Very good, very prominent, big name, Milgram, but it's groundbreaking work in social psychology. Great, so let's see if, I don't know, two people brought something here. Let me just see what we have over here. So we have the prison experiment, Stanford, we have the Ash conformity experiment, so that's a very good one. Lines, how long the lines are, and then there's objective truth. You can just see how long the lines are. But then if a room of people is saying something different from the objective reality, then it seems like some people tend to confirm to that. Social learning theory, again. So very good. I needed to ask myself how much of this would replicate, how credible this is, and like you, throughout my undergraduate, master's, PhD, I've heard about these studies again and again. I read them, fascinated by them. Some of it is what drove me into social psychology and doing these kind of experiments. So I really wanted to get a better understanding of what those are. Just before I get into the topic, there's one basic question that I want to ask you. Given all that you know from social psychology, from the experiments and all of that, there's this very famous question. And this question asks you, which of the two planets do you think that we live on? So from the very brief descriptions of the social psychology experiments that you've heard here, it seems like this is a kind of dark side of human nature. It seems like power corrupts. It seems like we might hurt others if given a command, right? It seems like there's all sorts of these very dark things within us. So finally, I just want to know if this influences our view of the planet. So let's say, for example, imagine an airplane which makes an emergency landing and breaks into three parts. As the cabin fills with smoke, everybody inside realizes we've got to get out of here. So which of the two planets is what happens in reality? On planet A, the passengers turn to their neighbors to ask if they're okay. Those needing assistance are helped out of the plane first. People are willing to give their lives, even for perfect strangers. On planet B, everyone's left to fend for themselves. Panic breaks out. There's lots of pushing and shoving. Children and elderly and people with disabilities, get trampled underfoot. So which planet do we live on? So going back to this, 3 years ago, in the middle of the pandemic, things were pretty dark. Then came out this very surprising book, Humankind, Hopeful History, Rutger Bregman. Have you heard of this book? Who has read this book or knows of this book? No? It's a very good book. If you know about Yuval Noah Harari. So this is kind of like a different take. So even Yuval Noah Harari reviews this book, and I've seen both of them side by side. So both of them are historians. They have a very different take as historians on what human nature is, where did we come from, what is it that we do. So Yuval Noah Harari in Homo Sapiens talks about how we survived because we're very good at gossip and socializing, and how we build narratives. So we're very good at storytelling. So we build cultures based on things that don't really exist, like money. Sometimes we create these things, so religions, in order to bring people together, in order to get some people to work into achieving some kind of goal. And here, Rutger Bregman is talking about the Homo puppy. He talks about, instead of Homo sapiens, Homo puppy, about the survival of the friendliest. So he's saying the way that we survived as a species is because we've been selected for being more social and more friendly and helping one another. So he talks about a hopeful history. He's very positive about who we are as a species. And he tackles one by one all of these famous classic studies by Milgram, by Zimbardo. So all the things that I'm going to talk to you about, he came out challenging them one by one. And what's interesting about this is that in the 2 years before that, when I came here to HKU to be an assistant professor, I've been teaching almost chapter by chapter the stuff that he goes through in his book. So for me, it was unbelievable to see, because I've been challenged on my view on these things. So it's nice to see a bestseller that gives a slightly different perspective on this. So I will argue throughout this lecture that many of these social psychology experiments are very, very flawed. Some of them are to the point of being fraud. So I will show you what it is that we think about these studies, and then I will show you why these studies are actually not what they claim to be. Not all of them, but definitely some of them. So here you can see that when I read this during the pandemic, I did a hike, listened to this as an audiobook, and I really enjoyed everything, is that to my great surprise, all of that I taught in my class is covered by this book. So my argument, the findings about humans inherently bad, are very, very flawed. So here's a very basic example from the book, which I really like. It was very difficult to find a piece online from Titanic, but he starts from examples like the Titanic narrative. So for example, if you've watched the wonderful Titanic movie, then this is what it looks like. The boat is about to sink. There's not enough boats over there, and everybody wants to get to the boats. And in order to fend the boats from overcrowded, everybody wants to get on there. They need to use guns and intimidation, and there's violence, and everybody, just like utter chaos. in actual reality, things are very, very different. And how do we know? Because we have people who survived and told us what actually happened over there. So, for example, here, New York Times, 1960s, there was no indication of a panic. There was no hysteria. There's no cries of fear. There's no running to and from, helping the kids and the women and the elderly into the boats. Everybody was just very calm and everything was very orderly. A little bit more like the planet with the calm, planet A, where everybody's calm and helping one another and wants to know that everybody else is okay. So in the movies, in the narratives that we've built for ourselves regarding all of this, finally what the reality actually is a lot more of this. So even when there is a tragedy, people come together and they help one another. So he gives a lot of different examples for this, also Second World War, also Lord of the Flies. So what happens when kids get stranded on an island? So the book would say that they would start, going at each other and then getting very, very violent. But actually it did happen in history that planes crashed and people were left on an island. And what they found at the end, that when they came to rescue those kids, they actually were all very supportive of one another and helped one another in order to survive. So the human nature story is very different from what the books would have us believe. So this is the place where I got this planet A, planet B from. So this is from Tom over here. He's a professor of social psychology in Groningen in the Netherlands. So he's been giving this thing for years. And then he would estimate, based on the many years that he has given this, that 97% of the people think that we live in planet B, which is the more pessimistic view of the world. So people don't think that we're very good. Most people tend to think that we're very selfish, that we won't support one another. And unfortunately, we, in social psychology, we the professors, we are a lot to blame for this because of all these studies about all the violence out there, Stanford prison experiment and all of that. But finally, it doesn't matter who you ask, left wing or right, rich or poor, uneducated or well-read, all make the same error of judgment. They don't know. Not professionals, not even emergency responders, and it's not for the lack of research. We've had this information available to us since the Second World War that we actually live on planet A. So there's accumulating evidence that A is the right one and not planet B. Another claim that he makes, which I really like, is that some people would say, but why is this important? So we've told everybody a certain story. So what? What does that matter for anything? So he gives this a Chinese story about the old man. An old man says to the grandchild, there's a fight going on inside me. It's a terrible fight between two wolves. One is evil, angry, greedy, jealous, arrogant, and cowardly. And the other is good, peaceful, loving, modest, generous and honest and trustworthy. These are two wolves also fighting within you and inside every other person too. And after a moment, the boy asks which wolf will win. And the old man smiles and says, the one that you feed. So the main point here, and we have things about the placebo effect, and we have all sorts of things in social psychology to support that notion that the story that you tell people about who they are, about who others are, is what actually creates reality. So if you tell people that they cannot trust others, if you tell people that power corrupts, there is the possibility that this would lead them, because of the institutions or because of the way that we deal with these as a society solutions, it will create more of such possibilities. So just as an example, he's a European, a Dutch, so obviously he does not feel comfortable with a lot of things that happen in the US. So in the US, there's a very big prison solution. So a lot of people are imprisoned, and it's very easy to put somebody away for a very, very long time. It's very different from the Dutch perspective or the Scandinavian perspective, where you want to rehabilitate. So you want to minimize the time that people spend in jails. So if you just want to punish people because you believe that people are inherently bad, you want to lock them away rather than giving them an opportunity in order to rehabilitate themselves and come back to society. So this is just one of these things. So I'll share with you what I think is one of the most interesting studies that has been conducted in social psychology in the last few years. We talked about one regarding the trolley dilemma. But trolleys are, it's like a game. You go on a website and you play with trolleys and all of that. This one involves a field experiment, a very, very interesting study. So what they did over here, civic honesty around the globe, is that, and I would love to get funding for doing something like this, they decided to lose wallets around the world and to see how many of these wallets they're going to get back. So they took a wallet, they put some money in the wallet, and then they left details with an email. And then they left this in all sorts of places, and they wanted to see how many of these wallets they're going to get back. And they did this with a very big sample of wallets in various places around the world. So you can ask yourself, put your scientist hat on, and think about all the interesting things that you can test when you have an experiment like this. So let's say I give you some money, you've won a grant from the HKU Council, and now you can conduct this kind of experiment. Let's say that you can get money in order to lose money around the world and investigate all kinds of research questions. What kind of research questions do you want to ask? Let's say that you have this kind of thing. What are good questions to ask in order for us to be able to get an understanding of human nature? What's a good way to go about this? What's a good method? What's a good research question? You can do this in many places around the world. You can put as much money as you want in the water. You can put whatever details you want. You can put it in different places in society. What's a good research question that you would have if you had this opportunity? What's the simplest question we can ask? Will people give back wallets? Are we going to get any of these wallets back? So if we're very pessimistic about human nature, there's no reason to think that we'll get back any wallets, right? So this is a very simple, what we call a main effect, right? Just descriptive, looking at the number of wallets received, right? So that's the baseline. What else can we do with this? Let's say that there's a variation. Number of wallets is not zero. What else can we play with? What kind of experiment we can run? Yeah, how much money is left inside? Very good, simple question, right? So we get back some wallets, right? Do they give back the entire sum or just some of the sum? This is great, right? So we can make all kinds of predictions. This number of wallets and the amount of, on average, the amount of money that will be in there will be that. Of the money that we put in, how much we're going to get back as percentage. Is that what you meant? Yeah, very good. Good, please. Yeah, good. So we can think about all sorts of ways in which we want to measure things like perhaps time. So how long does it take for this to be noticed or for this to be sent back? So we can also observe it. You know, we should leave a wallet there and just go to a next building and just look at what were people doing with the wallet? Are they ignoring it, taking it, opening it? So we can do all sorts of things rather than returning it, right? But even with returns, how will they return this? What kind of efforts will, if it's easy, perhaps it's easy, you just send an email. If there's no email, will they go to the police or do something more? Yeah. I had the unfortunate experience of leaving my wallet in a taxi in Hong Kong 2 years ago, and I wasn't sure if I'll ever see this wallet back. I also did not remember, I did not do this with an app, so I did not remember the taxi number. Turns out that there's a service where you can pay, I think it's like 800 Hong Kong, in order to broadcast to all the taxis in Hong Kong that you've lost your wallet. I'll tell you later if I got my wallet back or not. But it's a good question. It's like, if you lose a wallet in Hong Kong, if you leave it in a taxi, what are the chances that you'll get your wallet back? I would love to have enough research money in order for me to lose wallets in Hong Kong taxis. Yeah, great. So duration, amount of money, anything else? Who returns? Right. Perfect. Yeah, we have so many interesting questions there, right? So we want to know location-wise. It could be we want to compare different countries. Perhaps if we see who picks it up or who sends it back, gender-wise, men, women, who's more likely to give back, or perhaps we can tie this to the amount of money. Perhaps women and men will have different amounts of money, or how long it will take them to bring it back. Very good. So individual differences and also location differences or context differences. So many different questions, right? Yeah. So you can think, once you put on your scientist hat, what's going to come out of that. So I'll just share with you what is it that they found. So they've done this in 355 cities from 40 different countries. They lost 17,000 wallets, which is terrific. It's just they've hands down like the biggest, like most impactful one that I've seen. And they contained varying amounts of money. So you can also manipulate how much money you want to give in. So will people return or not return? Or perhaps the amount of money that we return depends on the amount of money that is in the wallet. Or perhaps you can put small amounts of money or large amounts of money. Perhaps you can put money, or like happened to me with the Hong Kong taxis, a lot of personal information. So, you know, my Hong Kong ID is in there, my HKU ID, like all sorts of other things that perhaps I will need back at some point, or it's a big procedure in order to find those again. So a lot of very interesting things, both in public and private institutions, and they measured a bunch of stuff. And what's interesting is that virtually in all countries, citizens were more likely to return wallets that contained more money, which is not what I expected. So if you think about this, the more money there was in the wallet, the more likely people were to return the wallet. Because you could have the exact opposite hypothesis saying, if there's more money in there, if people are really selfish, the more likely they are to keep this kind of money. So very interesting. Just to share with you that I got back my wallet. It took a while. I went to the police and I announced that I'm looking for my wallet. I got back my wallet. So all my IDs, my Hong Kong ID, my HKU ID and all this, but without the money and the octopus card that were there. So if this is like the money that they took for themselves in order to go through the whole procedure, I'm happy to pay that. So for me, it was a really interesting thing is like, what of the wallet is going to be returned? But if you just manipulate the money, it's very interesting. Here are some of the findings. So you can see over here, they had a no money condition, a money condition, and a big money condition. And you can see that as you go from no money to big money, in places like the United States and in places like the United Kingdom, there's a big incline. And it seems like in Poland, in general, people return more money. But you can see that there's a real incline here. Another very interesting thing, a little bit about context, right, is that you can see all the different countries over here, right? So I'll let you look at this for a second, and then you tell me what kind of things you notice about the differentiation between countries. So here we have how much money there was. So sorry, this is the money condition. This is the no money condition. So how much of the reporting rate? So we've got 0 to 80. So here, for example, with Switzerland, the top one, when it had money, people returned about, I don't know, above 70% and a little bit less than that with the no money condition. And then it goes down. Yeah, so I grew up in Israel. So Israel is somewhere in between. So when you look at this, what questions do you have? Now that you've seen some of the results, you're good researchers, you have good research questions. What kind of things are you observing? What kind of things do you see? Yes, please.
Generally high.
Yeah. Right. So first of all, relatively high, right? This is not what I would have expected. Overall, on average, it's 50. I think it's kind of around 50. And then you made a very interesting observation about disparity, right? So what did you notice? So can you tie this to something specific that you see? The Scandinavian countries, yeah? Right. Yeah, we've got a lot of Asian countries over here, and we've got more Scandinavians over there. Yeah, that is interesting. So what do you think makes that? So why is, let's say, inequality or disparities, why is that tied to reporting rates?
Everyone is pretty well off. Yeah.
Oh, everyone is, okay. So it's also level of development, right? How well off they are to begin with, right? Yeah, that's pretty good. A good research question. So we want to ask that. Somebody raised their hand? Yes? Anything else you're observing? Questions that you want to ask? Oh yeah, why are some of them reversed, right? Peru is like very, very small. I wouldn't make too much of it, but like Mexico, it's interesting. Like, why is that? So what differentiates Mexico from the rest of a good observation? Very good thing to ask. Yeah, anything else you notice? So obviously, we're in Hong Kong, right? So we look at this and we're like, okay, so where is Hong Kong? What's like the closest thing to Hong Kong? Oh, okay, so Hong Kong is not here, but there's China over here. So what's going on with China, right? So we want to know what's happening here. What's going on with China? I have to tell you, when this came out, people in Hong Kong and China were not happy with this study. Oh my gosh, were they not happy with this kind of study? So before I show you the very angry responses in Hong Kong and China about this, I just want to say that when you want to show how counterintuitive study is, you can do this in all sorts of ways. One thing that you can do is you can pre-register a study. And if you would pre-register a study, if I would run the study, I would pre-register the hypothesis that the more money there is in the wallet, the less likely people are to give back the money. But in reality, we see exactly the opposite. But another thing that you can do is you can actually look at what people are saying. So you can ask non-experts, if I would give you this study, what would you predict? So people predict, people giving less, the more money there is, people giving less money back, which is exactly the opposite trend. So when you want to show just how counterintuitive this is, people assume that others are selfish, that others will keep the money. But actually what happens in reality is that generally people give back money, but they give a lot more when it's actually big money. So that's very interesting. And it's not just like non-experts that are getting this wrong, but also the expert sample got this wrong. So they ask professors and they ask experts, what do you think is going to happen with the study? Which is very, very different from the actual reporting rates, right? So we have to ask this question because we're from this region, like what's going on with China, right? So Chinese score lowest in European American research. Ooh, somebody is already making a claim here because why? Because here you can see, look at all these Western names. Gosh, they're out to get us. Talking about in-group, out-group bias, these white people, they want to put the Scandinavians up on top. You've got all sorts of names. Some of them are Jewish. Some of them they seem like a European-like. It's like these Europeans, they just want to paint themselves in nice colors, and they want to diss the Chinese. And it doesn't take very much for us to feel excluded in Hong Kong and for us to feel like somebody is looking down on us. So even in the academic system, like if I tell people I come from HKU, they're like, what? Like where? Hong Kong, where is this in the world? If you ask people, like, where, show me Hong Kong on the map, people wouldn't know. There's a very, very strong bias in academia towards the West, you know? So if you have an Ivy League university in the US or UK, you are like, oh, very good university. HKU, who has heard of this? So HKU spends a lot of money in order to raise reputation across the world so that when you graduate and you go, let's say you want to go work in some other place to have postgraduate studies, that people will look at, oh, University of Hong Kong and say, oh, yeah, of course, an elite university, a very good university. But it's still, there's some imbalances, power imbalances in the world because the world is still very West oriented. So when you see names like this and you see a finding like that, you kind of wonder, what did they do with the data? So people were very angry about this whole kind of thing. And then they said, you know, they studied a very specific group of people. These were receptionists working at the counter. And then Wu Lin over here, a Wuhan University professor, was extremely, I don't know if you've ever seen the netizens in China angry. I've seen them angry a few times. But when they get angry with passion. And they found a lot of things. So Wu Lin here came out with a lot of excuses for why, excuses doesn't mean that they're not true. A lot of reasons for why this would not work well with China. So before I show you what Wu Lin, as a professor in Wuhan, said about this, what could explain why China is so low here? What is it about China? Some of it we know also here in Hong Kong, but especially in China, what could explain some of these very, very low rates? What kind of questions do we need to ask before we take this? Oh, China, of course, it's the lowest. Of course, the Scandinavians are the highest because they're so pure and terrific, right? We want to ask questions. What kind of questions can we ask, please? Yes. Yes, very good. So first you want to ask, is the way that you studied this, did you even involve Chinese people in order to understand how to do this in China? So it could be that China does things very differently. So for example, if you put an email there, that's for people to contact back and give back the wallets, do people really use email in China? And what is the answer to whether people use email in China or not? Not as common, right? What do people use in China mostly? WeChat, right? These kinds of things. So they use emails, but maybe less. So that's definitely one of the things that was raised. What else is different about the way China does stuff? Serious scams, yeah. So we also talked about this with the bystander, with Wang Yue, right? So in Wang Yue, maybe it's like you see a baby, it's like somebody gonna take me into some kind of scam because things have happened before and people are very, very scared of doing something like that. So maybe somebody left this wallet on purpose and me sending an email or doing something is going to trap me. Very good. Yeah. Taking responsibility. These receptionists, like what are they going to do when they see this kind of thing? Very good. Something about the context and about the trust that is in the system. Very good. What else could explain this? What else is there? When was the last time that you've been to mainland China? It's been a while for me, almost 5 years since the pandemic, I guess. So I haven't. But even before that, when I went to mainland China, it's very difficult for a tourist. Try and pay something with cash. It's just not, even the homeless people have a QR code. I had to buy something in the street, just scan this. I don't have, well, now we have Alipay Hong Kong, but back then I didn't have Alipay China. WeChat doesn't really work for me. You need to validate this with like 20 different documents. So I didn't have any one of these apps and I tried to pay with cash and people was like, no, we don't know what to do with cash. So people don't even know how to handle cash anymore in China. So that's another thing that came up. So it seems like there's just a lot of things that would be different over there. So for example, here they chose in China to put this in front of receptionists in a busy hotel. So this professor was saying receptionists working at a counter, working under high pressure and strain. In addition, most Chinese citizens do not use email for daily communication and they pay for things mostly by mobile phones. So actually, when I read this thing, I was like, yeah, this makes sense. So taking this down one by one. So started this communication between these researchers, this Cohen guy, and the Chinese people about what is wrong with the study. But this study is published in Science, very prominent. So people are going to already start having some impressions about these Chinese. They're the lowest in giving back what. We need to be very, very careful and humble. And when we see a study like this, we need to start asking questions. And my question to you, now that you've seen the debate, how to resolve this debate? Now that we want to understand exactly what happens, what would we expect from the scientific community? We want to understand something happening with China, whether generally, how solid are the results from the first study, science paper? What can we ask? What can we do? Yes, terrific. Yeah. So first, we want to see everything that they've done, right? How did you make all kinds of decisions? Who was involved in this kind of thing? Did you take the moment to go into each country and understand what it is that they did? And let's say that we want to do better. Let's try and work together in order to do the study better, in order to make sure that once this is done, nobody will have anything more to say. How to do this? We have something called adversarial collaboration. Adversarial collaboration is when we disagree, we put everybody together in the same room and say, okay, new study. We're going to run replication. We're going to repeat this again. And now we want all of you to agree on the best method. So we briefly talked about registered report before. So first we have a pre-registration plan before data collection. Not first we look at the results and then we make interpretations. But first we make predictions and then we pre-register them and then we proceed to the data collection, right? And then we want to see replications, not just one study, we want to see many studies, not just by white people, also people from the region, right? So very good things for us to consider. So this is the question that I asked myself for a while. And for a moment there, when this came out 3 or so years ago, and all this debate erupted, 5 years ago, I really wanted to try and do something here in this region, but I didn't have enough time. And luckily, somebody decided to do a replication of this. So you can see here, there's a very big group over here. Unraveling controversies over the civil honesty measurement and an extended field replication in China. So they ran this again. We conducted an extended replication study in China utilizing email response and wallet recovery to assess civic honesty. We found a significantly higher level of civic honesty in China as measured by the wallet recovery rate than reported in the original study, while email response rates remained similar. So they say, okay, they wanted to really check whether it's about the email thing, so they gave another way of doing it, and then they showed that actually when you use the previous one, email doesn't work, but if you have another way to recover it, it works a lot higher than in the original. And then they did even more than this. They asked for the procedures and the data, and they reanalyzed it, and we found that email response rates were inversely related to collectivism on the country level. So they started to do all sorts of additional analysis. So seems like a problem solved, right? China is no longer the last, right? So you go back to the original ones, the original authors, and you ask them, okay, so there was a replication and they found something different. Does that resolve anything in academia? Not always. And it really seems like in this case, so they ran very similar cities and they done all sorts of things. Of course, the Chinese were very happy about this. So talk about confirmation bias. Of course, when you see a study that you don't like, they're the white people. But when you see a study that you really like, it's like, oh, national pride, we returned wallets, right? We need to be very, very careful with confirmation bias. We need disconfirming stuff. But as you can see from China Daily, they were very happy about this. And they say, okay, yeah, we found it's the collectivism index that moderates this, that explains the whole story. And actually the Chinese are comparable to the others. But then as you can see, as usually happens, there starts like this debate. So here, the original authors are kind of like, no, what they found was it's upon closer examination, their findings were spurious and other conclusions contradicted by their data. They had an error in their regression specifications, once corrected the relationship between collector. And you would think, you know, if this is published in PNAS, which is like a big journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and this is published in Science, you would think that people know how to do methods well, that there would be no disagreement about how to run a simple regression. But it really seems like it just keeps on going back and forth, because then the Chinese reanalyzed the reanalysis of the reanalysis, and then they found out that there's, upon, you know, our replication of the simulation shows that it's impossible possible data points of the total simulation. Although the comments were premature, their critique inspired us, and then they keep on going and going. And this has been going on for like 5 years now. So we wanted a simple, so from the beginning, we had this perfect study, and we had these very clear results. And one of the results just happens to deal with China, and the Chinese get angry about this kind of stuff, and for good reasons. Because if this does not represent the truth, then we want to get closer to the truth. But on almost every other thing in that study, you could have pushed back. Did we see any replications? Has this been pre-registered? Do we know everything about the context? We don't always, and then we have this debate, right? So we wanted to know something about human nature. We started from a very positive view of human nature, saying people return more money when they had more money in the wallet, which is opposite to the selfish, but then there's lots of debates. So I just wanted to show you some of the complexity about things, right? So it's an ongoing study. There's an ongoing debate. And at some point, somebody's going to come up with the ultimate study that will give us pre-registered adversarial collaborations coming in together with open science, everything shared, everybody agreeing that the regression should be like this and should control for everything like that. But this is already doubting the very pessimistic view of human nature, because if anything, people returned wallet a lot more than we expected. And what's interesting is that they tended to return wallets more when there was more money. How much around the world? Maybe depends on context, and we need to really adjust this. But this is not the strange narrative that we had about humans being very, very selfish. Yeah? Okay, this is an initial case study. I'll give you a 5 minutes break. Go refresh yourself. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Stanford prison experiments and others. So we're going to discuss the bystander effect. Bystander effect is very, very famous. Perhaps you've heard about this. Just wanted to share with you a comedian that I follow on YouTube and TikTok and all that, talking about the bystander effect in New York.
I like living here. You'll see things in New York you don't see other places. Yeah. I was walking on Fifth Avenue. I came across a man that was laying there on Fifth Avenue bleeding. Other people walking by him. I couldn't believe it. I was the only one that had my phone out recording him.
New York has a very big reputation for just ignoring people. There's lots of homeless people. Last time I was in New York, I was in the Bronx. My hotel was in the Bronx, and oh my God, the Bronx is difficult. And you ignore a lot of these people just over there in the street. We're very fortunate in Hong Kong not to have the homeless problem. But we want to ask ourselves, like, the bystander effect, is it real? It's a very prominent finding from 1968. Basically showing that the more people there are around, the more likely people are to ignore what's going on over there. So one by one, 85% helped. But if it's in a group, only 31% helped, which is very, very worrying, because if there's a lot of people out there, that it just seems like people are just going to keep ignoring that. And since the 1968, we've had a lot of studies on this, trying to show the bystander effect. So in 1981, you can see after 10 years of research, they came to the conclusion that bystander effect is very, very robust across all emergency types, in all populations. And overall helping may increase or decrease because of the variety of issues, the pattern of less helping when there are more bystanders available. So this is very worrying about us not taking responsibility when we see something going on over there. And we try to understand, why is this happening, noticing the event, interpreting the effects, what's happening over there in the situation, illusion of transparency, pluralistic ignorance. We have a lot of keywords in social psychology to try and explain what happened back there. This is an example from a recent study, somebody who I know, with a very interesting field experiment. So for example, here you can see what happens if the homeless guy is wearing a suit or not wearing a suit. It seems like people help homeless people who wear suits more than people who don't wear a suit. So very, very odd kind of findings in all sorts of different ways. And all the issues with the bystander effect started in 1968, because in 1964, there was a case study, a very famous case study that we talked a little bit about in the previous session, about Kitty Genovese. So Kitty Genovese is what rocked New York and rocked the world, where she was raped and then later murdered in the middle of a street in New York. And people heard her cries and did not help. And throughout my time in my undergraduate, in all the books, throughout my PhD, the story of Kitty Genovese was one of the things that showed about just how bad human nature is. Like, we don't help others. So this was a genuine cry for help, and then we did not help Kitty. And because of that, we started doing all the research about the bystander effect, which showed that people just don't help. However, what's interesting about the Kitty Genovese story is that all of it is wrong. And what's amazing about all of it being wrong is that now we have not only evidence that everything is wrong, but also the newspaper that wrote the story about this, that broke the story about Kitty Genovese, has admitted to the story being very, very wrong. So I'll just show you the video that came out. And this happened when the murderer died in prison. So typically murderers go for a life sentence, which is 30 years, but he was again and again stayed in prison. He was never let go. And only when he died in prison at age 81 did people go back to revisit the story of Kitty Genovese. So it's not that she was not murdered, but there was a lot of stuff about the story over there that were just plain wrong. So I'll just play the video for you so you understand just how many things we got wrong about that story.
Her name was Kitty Genovese, a woman whose murder became infamous the world over because nobody tried to save her. Listen to how it was reported.
At least 38 residents of this apartment building heard her screams and did nothing.
That's the legacy of Kitty Genovese, who was murdered in Queens, New York in 1964. Her story is taught in psychology classes, and her name is synonymous with people who look the other way when trouble happens.
Nothing. No witnesses, just a lot of listeners. It's the post-Kitty Genovese era. No one wants to look. They think they'll get involved.
In 1964, Kitty Genovese was murdered outside her home in the middle of the night.
Incredibly, last Sunday's episode of HBO's Girls featured a staged reenactment of the Kitty Genovese case.
Dad, I think there's a lady in the courtyard.
It can't be anything good this time of night.
Hearing of Winston Mosley's death, Girls creator Lena Dunham wrote on Instagram, "Today we learn her killer has died. Spooky timing. Rest in peace, Kitty." So what really happened the night Kitty Genovese was murdered? Kevin Cook is the author of Kitty Genovese, The Murder, the Bystanders, the Crime That Changed America.
The idea that New Yorkers watched and did nothing, didn't lift a finger to help this poor dying girl, stuck in the public mind, but it was a lot more complicated than that.
It happened here. Kitty Genovese was almost home when she heard a man's footsteps behind her. She ran, but the man caught up to her and stabbed her twice in the back. She screamed, "Oh God, I've been stabbed." What happened next? That's where fact and fiction take separate paths.
He fled, she turned and went back around this corner.
Kitty was attacked by a man named Winston Mosley. The author says the fact that she was able to walk after the initial attack probably led people to believe they didn't have to call the cops.
People are looking out their windows. They see Kitty Genovese here. They see her struggle to her feet. She staggers around this corner into the darkness and is no longer visible to the people.
No longer visible to the people over here. It was past 3 a.m. Thinking the trouble was over, people went back to bed. They were unaware that a wounded Kitty Genovese was still in mortal danger.
Kitty sought shelter in here. She was able to get into this door.
That's when Mosley returned and raped and stabbed Kitty to death in this vestibule. According to Cook, a man at the top of the stairs saw it happen, but did nothing to stop it. A tragic story, but it got much worse 2 weeks later when a front-page story in the New York Times declared 37 who saw murder didn't call the police. The author says that number was totally distorted.
There were certainly dozens of ear witnesses and eyewitnesses, but when you talk about the people who both heard something or saw something and knew what it meant, knew what was going on, I don't think it's more than half a dozen.
And Cook says one neighborhood man remembers his dad calling the cops on that fateful night.
He swears that his father did call the police, was put on hold, told the police, there's a woman staggering around out there, she's been beaten up, you need to come. There was no answer to that call. Because in those days, there was no 911 system. That's something that grew out of the Kitty Genovese case.
So the legend of Kitty Genovese was born.
It led to many sermons in churches. It led to gossip. It went viral in the way that things.
Yeah, so already we see the beginning of a bunch of facts not really being facts. So when you see these kinds of facts, you want to know exactly what happens. So it turns out that there you have academic articles that went into this by people who actually know their stuff. So this came out in 2007 when this is American psychologist, so a very, very prominent journal, where they talk about the parable of the 38 witnesses. So here's a little bit of what happened over there. So the story of Kitty Genovese is not supported by the available evidence. There is no evidence for the presence of 38 witnesses, or that the witnesses observed the murder, or that the witnesses remained inactive. The New York Times, many, many years later, came out with an update to this. The article their own article, grossly exaggerated the number of witnesses and what they had perceived. None saw the attack in the whole thing that took place. Only a few had glimpsed part of it or recognized the cries for help. Many thought that they had heard lovers or drunks quarreling. There were 2 attacks, not 3. And afterwards, 2 people did call the police. A 70-year-old woman ventured out in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning, cradled the dying victim in her arms until they arrived, and Miss Genovese died on the way to the hospital in that woman's arms, which is not the story that I've heard when I was in my undergraduate. So here's the final summary of this whole thing. One neighbor actually raced from her apartment to rescue, knowing that she was in distress, but unaware whether her assailant was still in the scene. So it could be that the murderer was still there. And people raced in 3 in the morning. After calling the police, they raced down to help her. My gosh, these are stuff that I've not heard about when I was told this story. It's clear that she went to great efforts to save and comfort Kitty, giving the lie to the idea that no one helped, no one cared about this. So it's just absolutely, baffling how this whole thing happened. And when it comes to the bystander effect, we had a meta-analysis with the findings from 1968. But what actually happens when you meta-analyze everything about the bystander effect? And this is a lot more updated from 2011. I was hoping for something a bit more recent. But when we look at this whole thing, when you look at 7,700 participants, overall effect size of minus 0.35. So people definitely help less when there's more people around. However, you would want to look at the moderators. And this is a very interesting moderator. So the bystander effect was attenuated when situations were perceived as dangerous. So when situations were perceived as dangerous, people intervened more. So they came to help more. And then you had perpetrators who were present. So when you had people who created the violence, people helped more. And then the cost of interventions were physical. So when the costs were physical, people helped more. So the more dangerous, the more likely it is for people to get hurt during, people intervene more. So just like with the wallets, when there's a real danger, when there's real harm, people help more. And this is based on all the evidence that we have up until 2011. This is not what I was told when I was doing my undergraduate and my PhD. This is a completely different reversal of that. So you do need to look at the main effect, but you also need to look at the moderators, and you need to look at a recent meta-analysis, the most recent meta-analysis that aggregates everything together. And when you told the story about Kitty Genovese, just go and search for that information to know whether this information is really a fact and what that fact actually means for that. So if you want to hear a good podcast about this, I strongly recommend the Freakonomics Radio. They did a whole episode about this, but it's really amazing that this is how we're doing this. Finally, to conclude the whole thing about the bystander effect, I'm going to show you a BBC video about this, and it talks about a study which had a replication since then about do people really help? Do people really intervene when there's a danger, a situation?
Of us being individuals that are only interested in our own interests, that is not how it works. The myth is that when people observe somebody in need of help in public, then they have a tendency to kind of just stand there and look at each other. Our research shows that that's not at all what's happening. From pretty low-scale conflicts to stabbings and really severe violence. In all types of situations, they try to de-escalate the conflict. They put themselves between the conflict parties, trying to pull them apart. So is it always a good idea to play an active role? You know, is it also a good idea to be active if you are in an armed robbery situation? We were surprised by the high frequency of it, and we were also surprised by seeing similar frequencies in these 3 different countries that we looked at. As a cultural anthropologist, I would have expected pretty big cultural differences, but what we see is that there are some universal features in these very tense situations. A lot of social psychologists would be pretty upset if I would say that I disproved it. In many ways, I think we did, but the point is that they've been looking at something else than what we've been looking at. So our point now is a bit, now with the CCTV footage, we can actually gain understanding of human behavior in a way that we haven't been able to get before. Violence and aggression, you can't study that in a lab setting. The urgency is different in real life. So that idea, if you stumble when you enter the subway and people will not help you, I mean, that's not what we see. That's an idea that we all have, but that's not how the reality works.
Very, very interesting. So instead of instead of doing all these lab experiments and putting people in a situation, you can have observations using CCTV in order to see what the actual results are. So I'll just summarize this in this kind of study. As you've seen, it's like most people, 9 out of 10 public conflict people intervened by at least one person, often more, and did something to help, and they did this in 3 different cultural studies. And then there's like replication. So people thought, okay, so we can analyze CCTV footage. Let's do this. And then you found that in the presence of danger, bystanders were 19 times more likely to intervene than the absence of danger. So all the moderators that we saw from the bystander effect actually are replicated here. If anything, the police is very upset about this because they don't want people to intervene. They want people to call them. So they're putting themselves into danger. But actually people do want to help and intervene and make sure that everybody is okay. When we look at all sorts of behavioral studies in the lab and we see tendencies for collaboration and cooperation, people sometimes claim that we're becoming more selfish and more cynical. But as you can see here, the trend is actually on the positive side. So it's not declining. It's somewhere in between no change to an increase. But generally, you can see the cooperation rates are generally about 50%, which is a lot more than a lot of people expect. So it's interesting because you can aggregate these kinds of things. And talking about inequality, so it does seem that inequality, when you have a higher Gini coefficient, unfortunately, in Hong Kong, we have one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. It seems like when wealth is very, very visible, then it seems to moderate the bystander effect and people tend to help less. That would also partially maybe contribute to understanding the New York context in the funny comedy video that we saw at the beginning. Going onwards to talk about the Stanford prison experiment. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a video here that you can watch afterwards, but it's a little bit like what was described here at the beginning. What to say about the Stanford prison experiment? It's so troubling. I don't even know where to begin with this because for many of us, we got into social psychology because of Zimbardo, because of this experiment, because of what it is that it showed. But everything about this is problematic. And I think this cartoon kind of summarizes this for me. So people say, they're very pessimistic, and they say power corrupts and all this. And then what is it based on? I based my view of human nature on 6-day-long study of 22 non-random young males in which the experimenter was an active participant. So all of this is true. Zimbardo was not an experimenter outside. This was not an experiment. Almost everything about this experiment was staged. Later on, when we saw the protocols, it was revealed in the Stanford archives about what took place over there. It seemed like everything about this just feels very wrong. So I'll show you a summary. I'll just say that one of the prominent people in Open Science, who is now the editor of Psychological Science, so that's one of our prominent journals, this is how she summarized this. Psychologists, please read this. We must stop celebrating this work. It is anti-scientific. Get it out of the textbooks. Get out the Stanford prison experiment from the textbooks. Unbelievable. Famed Stanford prison experiment was a fraud, scientists said. And there's every indication that this is indeed a fraud. I'll show you the summary here.
This kind of behavior. I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior.
I gotta go to a doctor, anything. Jesus Christ, I'm burning up this guy, don't you know?
Yeah, so it's very unfortunate, but this is a good summary for that. It did seem like an improv class. So a lot of people that were interviewed, so Ben over here did a very good job at going through the archives, going through all the recordings, interviewing everybody involved, and every aspect of the Stanford so-called experiment, prison experiment, seems very, very shoddy. So we have a lot of issues with Zimbardo because he does not seem to handle this very well. So, for example, corpus breakdown was a sham. Why did he do this? Because he was worried about failing to go into grad school, and Zimbardo was one of the faculty over there. Zimbardo, of course, orchestrated the whole thing, and then a lot of things about he did not give them the ability to just walk out of the experiment, so there was like ethical concerns about this. So every step of the way, people just pretending to do all sorts of things because there were all sorts of pressures for them to act in a certain way. So all this was a staged kind of act in order to portray a certain message at the end. And these are just some of the headlines that came out of this. It was deeply flawed at the beginning, as a beginning for this. It might be very, very wrong. And then we learned that this was a fraud. Finally, we've got debunking of this. So if you want to know more about this, this is the debunking. So these new criticisms include the bias and incomplete collection of the data. So he orchestrated this, he conducted, he devised this, and practiced this in classes 3 months earlier. the fact that the guards received precise instructions, and the fact that the guards were told, were not told that there were subjects. And anyway, there's like a lot of issues here. I invite you to go and look at this debunking. Why is this covered? Yeah, the debunking of the Stanford prison experiment. So if you want to know the best evidence, you should really look at people who know about this. But even more than this, sometimes we ask, are there any replications? Why not just run this again? So obviously some ethical considerations, just like with the trolley dilemmas. So whenever we have ethical concerns about whether we should do this or not, who do we go to? TV shows. We have a TV show that ran this. So the BBC actually ran the Stanford prison experiment. It's called The Experiment. It's pretty interesting to see because it's very different from how things happen. And the psychologists that they worked with in order to do this summarized this in an article over here. You've got Alex who summarized that. Unlike the prisoners, the guards failed to identify with their roles. This made the guards reluctant to impose their authority, and they were eventually overcome by the prisoners. Participants then established an egalitarian social system. They all sat together, held hands, and sang songs together, the prisoners and the jailers together. So a very different story from what it is that we've been told and when it was repeated once again. But there were all sorts of other things. At the beginning, they wanted to establish a democracy together, the jailers and prisoners wanted to establish a democracy. But once they were unsuccessful in establishing a democracy, then started to be a tyranny. So it was very interesting to see what happens when there's a failure of a group coming together in order to establish some rules. So even a TV show is not exactly the experiment that we were hoping for, but it already contradicts the story by Philip Zimbardo in the Stanford prison experiment. There's a very long video here of the people who ran that study. If you want to know more about why the Stanford prison experiment is not good and some of the insights about the BBC prison experiment, then you're welcome to go and have at that. And so we have a problem with the bystander effect, and now we know that actually people help one another, and there's all sorts of indicators that people even intervene and put themselves in harm's way in order to help. Stanford prison experiment, rather than abusing one another, they sit together holding hands and singing songs. So obviously some stuff is wrong. And the question is, what about Milgram? Because Milgram is very, very worrying. So what happens when a person in a white coat tells you the experiment must proceed and you're hurting somebody else? So I won't show you the video about this. I'm assuming that most of you know about this, but if you want to refresh, you can go and have a look at this. And unfortunately, I would have really liked to tell you that Milgram does not replicate, but actually we've replicated Milgram many, many, many times. And it's very disturbing to see that people do obey a person in a white coat. And we ran a replication here, and 45 years later, in 2006, just slightly lower. So people go all the way to the most deadly shocks at the end of the study. And if we want another TV show, there's another TV show called The Heist. He was looking for psychopaths, and he wanted to know who would go all the way in order to help him take down a bank, go into a bank and steal some money. So Darren Brown ran the Stanford prison experiment, and he found something very, very similar to the rates in the original. I'll just show you the summary of it.
In the original Milgram experiment, psychologists were asked to predict how many people would continue to the point that they were administering the highest shock on the board. Their prediction was 0.1%. They were wrong. The results of our experiment were almost identical to the original. Over 50% of participants continued up to 450 volts. The majority of people will administer lethal electric shocks just because a guy in a white coat is telling them to. 450 volts. 450 volts. 450 volts. 450. So after the results of the Milgram experiment, I've now chosen my 4 subjects that will go forward for the heist.
Yeah, so he keeps going with this, but this is to show you that even the TV show was able to replicate these things. And finally, when we meta-analyze all of that, so we've got, for example, 23 small samples, 21 conditions, 740, obedience involved progression to a maximum voltage by 43.6%, which is very, very worrying. But what we see here is that we need replications, and we have several replications, and then we need a meta-analysis. And finally, at the end, we can aggregate all of these together. And of all the classics, unfortunately, Milgram does indeed hold and does show something about human nature that is quite dark. Here's another one. I think this is the most recent one I saw, 2017. In Poland, the results achieved show a level of participants' obedience towards instruction similarly high to the original Milgram study. So even when people hear about this, even though it's, we've talked about this a million times throughout, then still there's this is still happening throughout the years in different cultures from around the world. The same Alex from before that did the Stanford prison experiment is also associated with stuff here with Milgram. So you can see So you can see that even here he was involved and showed some tendency for obedience to authority. So this is just to give you a teaser about many of the things that we'll be discussing in upcoming classes. But it is to say that even when we think that we know something, because we've been taught this in Introduction to Psychology or Social Psychology, or it's been written in some books, even if it's academic articles, we need to doubt information, be critical of information. There's a way for us to look at scientific evidence, credible scientific evidence, looking at replications, looking at meta-analysis, revisiting some of the facts and the information in order to make sense of what's happening, even with the classics. And it turns out that some of the things, like Stanford Prison Experiment, are complete shams, and some of the things are not what we thought they were in bystander effects. And if anything, overall, we can conclude that things are complex. Human nature is not inherently bad. The indications are that it's complex, but it tends to be rather good. But that there are some issues, like, for example, with in-group, out-group bias. There's obedience to authority. So we need to be very careful about that in the way that we structure our society and the way that we combat these things. So you can see the most that we need to take into consideration is the issues about power, in-group, out-group, and authority and power. But generally, my message to you is that we have a lot of reasons for optimism. Finally, the last words that I want to give you are from Rutger Bregman, who wrote the book, Humankind. And this was written during the pandemic, so people were asking, like, why are you putting this book out now? Nobody's going to read this, nobody's going to buy this. But I think he had a very important message, and this is the message that I want to leave you with. So if you're worried about human nature and you're very pessimistic about human nature, if anything, the way that I've been looking at the literature in social psychology gives us reason for optimism and hope.
My name is Rutger Bregman, and I'm the author of the new book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. It's a book about a simple but quite radical idea. What if most people, deep down, are pretty decent? In the past 15 to 20 years, there has been a silent revolution in science. Scientists from very diverse disciplines, psychologists, anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, have moved from a quite cynical view of human nature to a much more positive and hopeful view, and have actually been arguing that we are hardwired to be friendly and to cooperate, and that actually this is our true superpower as a species. Now, I think this is a quite revolutionary idea, because what you assume in other people is what you get out of them. If you assume that most people deep down are just selfish, as we have been assuming for the past 30 to 40 years, then you'll start designing your institutions around that idea, right? Your schools, your workplaces, your democracies, and that's what you get out of people. What you assume in other people is what you get out of them. Now, if we move to a new, more hopeful, more realistic view of human nature, I think that changes everything. And it's also a quite subversive idea, because if we don't trust each other, if we think that, people are deep down are just selfish, then we need them, then we need the CEOs and the presidents and the bureaucrats and the generals and the monarchs and the kings and you name it. We need those in power to keep each other in check. But if we actually believe in each other, if we believe that most people can be trusted, then we can move to a very different kind of society, a much more egalitarian kind of society where, we bring out the best in each other. That's the simple but quite radical idea that I'm defending in my book, Humankind, A Hopeful History. Now, it's a strange time to be publishing a book. I've worked on this for 5 years. For 5 years, I've tried to connect the dots, and I'm just trying to show that there's something bigger going on here, because there's so many brilliant specialists who have been working on this new view of human nature, but they often don't realize from each other that they're not alone. So at one point I was interviewing a psychologist who had been doing fascinating work on the so-called bystander theory, which is the idea that during times of crises or when there's an emergency, say someone's drowning or someone's attacked in the street, that we don't help. And this psychologist actually showed that in 90% of all cases, based on CCTV camera footage, right? So real incidents, in 90% of all cases, people actually help each other. And so I told her about new theories from biology, where biologists lately have been talking about the concept of survival of the friendliest, which has been happening in our evolution. That for thousands of years, it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And I told her about this, and she said, oh my God, so it's been happening there as well. And this is the only thing that I've been trying to do, is just to connect the dots, to show that there's something bigger going on.
So I'll leave it here. Leave you with this message, just for you to think a little bit more about social psychology, human nature, and all of that. And we'll continue talking about these topics in the upcoming weeks. That's all for this week. Thank you.